You can actually click onto the agenda there. So we're really excited to start sharing some details around the Pathways program, which is a part of the NYC Green Fund. Thank you for joining us. We have a pretty stacked agenda today, but it'll be segmented into two parts. So we'll be starting with a Green Fund update, and we'll be going over just where the Green Fund is at right now. A lot of you have been familiar with our work in the past as well. So we just like to kind of check in and let you know where things are at with that. And we'll be getting into more specifically the pathways, strategies, and guidelines. And then from there, we'll go ahead and get into a little bit more of the details with the application overview, including, those guidelines, but the application process itself and some of our scoring and review process as well. And then that segment I referred to with the Q&A, we'll be getting into that after the application overview. And this last part listed with the breakout rooms is what I mean by the two-part segment, which I included in the email as well. But just to give everybody sort of an idea of understanding for what we're going to be doing, it'll be less of a presentation from our team with CPF and more so a interactive component for you all to be getting to talk to each other about the work that you're interested in, what you're working on now, how that might fit into pathways, how you might be able to collaborate with one another. The idea of those breakout rooms is to really be a collaborative tool. It is not required, but we do welcome you to stay on for that if it feels purposeful to you all. And I would just like to introduce the folks on our team for a moment. So today we've got Emily Sherrod, who is with us as the director of the Green Fund and partnerships within City Parks Foundation. And we've got Heather Lubov, who is the executive director. And we've got Tim Tompkins, who is with Shared City, Shared Space. We are really excited to have a panel like this for you all and to get everybody in one call. So just excited for you to get to hear a bit from each of them. And then we're gonna kind of I'm gonna go ahead and just hand this over to Heather actually to start and get into it.
Thank you, Vanessa, and welcome everyone. It's good to see your familiar faces and new faces. I want to thank all of our funders that make this possible, and our board member, Gail Gordon, who's helping to oversee our work on the Green Fund, and Arturo Garcia-Costas from the New York Community Trust, who has been co-chairing with Gail and sort of leading the charge and getting the Green Fund off the ground. So as you all probably know, the Green Fund started as a result of COVID and making sure that open spaces got some extra funding at a time when there was significant need and significant cutback at the city level. And fundraising became even more difficult. So it was originally meant as a 3-year emergency response, but we've had such a good response from funders, and we know that there is a huge need for private support throughout the city. We did a quick feasibility study to determine whether or not we could continue the fundraising. Would there be an interest and capacity to do so? The answer was a resounding yes. So we are going to keep going. We have a goal for at least the next 5 years to raise hopefully what will be $30 million or more to redistribute in the form of grants, large and small, to help support parks and open spaces all across the city. Our focus is on equity, so we are looking at the spaces that need private support the most, that don't have communities around them to provide that private support. And the goal is really to encourage stewardship, free programming, health and wellness activities, capacity building, workforce development, all the really good things that activate parks and open spaces and keep communities engaged and together. The Pathways program was set aside by the funders themselves when they first set up the Green Fund, because basically what they said to us was, we'll give you emergency money for now. We understand this is an unprecedented time, and we want to make sure that people have open spaces to use. when they're isolated. But we do not want the city to think that this means that there can be less public funding. And we don't want this cycle to continue where the private sector will just step in anytime the city steps back. We really want there to be a change in the system such that parks and open spaces receive enough funding to operate as they should without the need for private philanthropy. That is the goal. I don't know that we can get there in the next year or in the next 5 years, but the goal is absolutely to try to stabilize funding for parks and open spaces going forward. So we are here today to talk about some of the ways perhaps that you all have in mind to do that. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation. I'm thrilled if any of you saw or read the Center for an Urban Future report on alternative funding models for parks. That was funded by a grant from the Green Fund, which gives us a roadmap for the kinds of activities that we could undertake, for example. And there are other studies that the Green Fund has funded as well that provide additional data that we can use. So I'm hoping that we have a really productive conversation today with some great ideas. We really want you all to collaborate. That's the goal. We don't have a lot of money to go around. So the more people work together, the more effective and efficient we will all be. So I hope you will all consider staying and talking to one another during the breakout sessions. It is now my pleasure to introduce Tim Tompkins, who is, among other things, the founder of Partnerships for Parks, a very visionary program that engages community all around the city in parks, and who has been advising us all along the way on what direction the Pathways program should take. So I will turn things over to Tim.
Thank you very much, Heather, and it's great to chat with folks. How do I advance the slide here? Is there someone else? Vanessa, are you able to do that? Oh, there. Great.
One back, Heather.
Yeah, so in addition to founding Partnerships for Parks, there's also a point at the end of that process when we had a campaign in 2001 to try and get 1% of the budget for parks, and we got a lot of commitments from people, but then 9/11 happened and that fell away. And so a lot of the thinking around the systems change and pathways grants has been about recognizing that sometimes there is a moment in time when certain ideas take hold and there's a possibility of a change to the system. It's also a reminder that the system has been inequitable and problematic for a long time in terms of the amount of funding for parks and public spaces in New York City. And so really the criteria for this are a little different from the very specific shorter term needs of some of the other Green Fund grants, which is recognizing that some ideas that get developed in terms of how the system might change in terms of new funding mechanisms, different funding mechanisms, sustainable funding mechanisms, and how the funding mechanisms are more equitable across the system, how the city supports and nurtures park partners of small and big size, of resource and less resource size, are all things that need to be considered and thought about and worked on. And that it takes time. And it also takes the development of ideas that may or may not at any given point in time have a chance of success. I think the Cuff report was a great report outlining 20 different ideas. Any one of them may or may not be immediately taken up, but they're all legitimate ideas to be pursued. Other research that has been done in the past looks at ways to fund the system more fairly and fully. But as we know, it's not only about having a set of policy ideas or proposals with respect to funding or the empowerment of neighborhood groups. It's also about having the strength within and beyond the parks community to have the leadership, the civic leadership and the elected leadership of the city respond and say, yes, we're going to embrace these ideas and move them forward. And so any advocacy campaign has to be both about the substance of proposals that are developed, but also about developing and broadening the constituency so that supports those changes and having an effective communication strategy that is linked to the substance and findings and the data. If we can go forward, next slide. And so the kinds of things that we think could be funded through this kind of thing is activities which help to broaden and strengthen the constituency of park supporters, to form alliances where it makes sense with people beyond the parks world, where there might be a broader constituency supporting place-based partners and public space partners, developing research and communication strategies linked to that research that can frame the issues in a different way, maybe to test some new pilot mechanisms or funding mechanisms like the things in the Cuff report, to show, hey, this can work and the system can become stronger if either parks or the city does things in a different way. And then also recognizing that this takes multi-year collaborations. And a lot of the purpose of this conversation and the methodology of having people talk early in the process is making sure that very effective organizations are not doing or proposing to do exactly the same thing. Maybe there's complementary skills, maybe there's parallel activities that can be done. Next slide, please. And ultimately, the bottom line is saying the goal is longer term is activities which may not happen immediately, but over the course of time, when there's a political moment that is right, when there's a moment when people are willing to take action in government to do things differently, that creates a more equitable system, because we know that many parks in more resourced areas do very well because of amazing partnerships, and many other parks simply don't have the private or philanthropic resources or can't sustain them to make a difference. So an equitable and a vibrant park system where public funding is sustainable, or other funding tools that are sustainable, that are not only philanthropic funds, can increase across the system, and that there's a commitment to empowering the partners and the communities and engaging the communities that are part of parks, so that they can be more effective in making parks and communities vibrant. And if this all works, then this works for every park in the system, not just those with more resources. But parks with more resources are an important part of a coalition to achieve the goals that need to be achieved by the Pathways grants.
Thank you, Tim. So I want to reiterate, Heather, if you can go back one slide, thanks. I want to reiterate the two main goals that we're outlining are essentially, we're looking to bring in more funding for the parks and open space system, whether that's private or public funding. And we're looking to make doing business with the city easier for the non-governmental partners on this. Heather, if you can go to slide 6, back 2 slides. I also want to acknowledge that this is one of the grant programs that we have this year. If you might have gotten emails throughout this year, we anticipate having 3 grant programs. Pathways is first. That's what we're talking about today. We're looking for systemic change on this. The Partnerships for Parks team has also launched an application for grassroots funding, and they'll have another application this summer for grassroots funding. So that's geared towards organizations with operating budgets up to $175,000 annually. And that funding is more so geared towards programming. So if you're looking for programming funding and your operating budget's under $175,000, grassroots would be the place for you to look for that application. Vanessa and I'll also be working on an application this summer for the Treetops Grant Program. That's for organizations that have operating budgets between $175,000 up to $2.5 million. And those grants are also for programming. So the funding that we're talking about today through the Pathways program, it's not to lead public programming in parks and open spaces across the city. It's really to support that systemic change piece. So I just want to make sure that folks are, you're coming to the right grant program for this. If you have any questions, we're also happy to talk offline and help you navigate to figure out which grant program might be the right fit for you. So we'll drop the email address in the chat. Heather, if you can go ahead a slide and a couple more to the eligibility. Perfect. Okay, so now that we've talked through the 3 grant programs that we have, if you have questions about whether your organization is eligible or whether the project that you'd like to propose is eligible, At the start of the application, we also have an eligibility quiz that you can take a look at. It's essentially drilling down to understand, is your organization a 501c3 or do you have a fiscal sponsor? Do you have experience working in the open space field? Is the proposal that you're submitting aligned with one of the 2 primary areas that we're looking to support this year? And double checking to confirm if the expenses that you're submitting today are eligible for consideration. And then finally, if you are a past grantee of the Green Fund, making sure that any past reports that you have all been submitted before you submit this application. You can go ahead. Thank you. In terms of the eligible expenses, I do want to be clear. So staff costs is eligible, consulting fees and contractors and professional fees are eligible, equipment and supplies is eligible, marketing and outreach costs is eligible. That's all as long as it aligns with the proposal that you're submitting, those 2 priority areas. Things that would be ineligible would be basic maintenance work to take place in your open space, public programming, if it's especially when it's not related to a policy change or piloting a project, any electioneering, lobbying, or litigation. I would like to pass it to my colleague Vanessa now to talk through the application process. So just a reminder, if you have any questions, please feel free to add them in the chat and we'll cover them during the Q&A section. And I would also like to ask to make sure that you rename yourself. We've got a lot of Vanessa Butlers in the room, and there is only one Vanessa Butler here with us today, I believe. So if you're named as Vanessa Butler, please take a second to rename yourself so that we know who we're speaking with throughout the day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emily. All right, so getting into the application itself, we are working this year on a 2-step process for our application. That will begin with a LOI, or a letter of inquiry, sometimes known as a letter of intent. That's just going to be a introduction to your work rather than a comprehensive application. So those questions for the LOI are what you see on if anybody's logged into that application yet, that is the LOI that you are looking at. And from that LOI, we'll be reviewing to understand what alignment to the program that work looks like. And if we see that strong alignment and feel that the applicant will be a strong candidate for the full application review, we will then invite you to apply to the full application. The hope here is that we are not asking for more labor than necessary from you all. If there might just be, maybe your work is actually better for treetops. And I'm just saying that as an example. We want to make sure that we're not asking you for a fully detailed application before we come to that conclusion. So that LOI followed by the full application. And we also want to emphasize that you all can apply individually or with collaborators. We really think that collaboration can be a strong component of this work, and certainly hope that today might serve as a spark to some ideas and ways in which you might be able to do that. That is not required in any way, just simply if it is a way to strengthen your work and split the work up, then that is certainly an option to you all. I will note, however, that if you are applying with collaborators, the budget should represent the cost of that collaborator's work as well. So they would be getting a portion of that grant for that work as well. And so, as you all likely know by now, the LOI itself is already open. That opened on the 8th of February. That'll be open for just about a month, and it'll be due by March 7th at noon, 12 p.m. So we'll send out reminders for that due date as well. And we also invite you to reach out to us if you would like to set up a consultation of any kind. We're really here to work with you all to understand what type of proposal you might want to put together. You don't have to be, operating in silo on that. We are happy to discuss, go through your work and different. I know a lot of these organizations that are applying are working on a number of different aspects of projects. And so we just want to make sure that you all know we are very much available to go through, which parts of that work are maybe more aligned with Pathways versus not. And then once that LOI date passes is when we will send out the requests for proposals. And we're aiming for that to be done by the end of March. And as always, we are available to you all both in the process of planning out your application. And I am available to you all if an application doesn't get approved. I'm more than happy to talk through, what our reviewers sort of came to the conclusion of and be as transparent as we possibly can with that process. We know it takes a lot of work to be providing these applications and to be sharing your work, and we take that very seriously. All right, and then moving on to some of the funding history here. And what you can expect for funding from this round. So we can award up to 8 grants between $50,000 and $150,000 this year. You can apply for either a 1-year grant or a 2-year grant, but as always, that funding is pending funds raised for that successive year, that second year. And just to give you all an idea of what funding has looked like in the past, the average grant size for the systems change program last year was $51,000, and then the largest grant size was $85,000. Our hope is that the budgets are focusing on expenses that they're supporting activities that would not otherwise be possible without that funding. So just bear that in mind. And then we can move on to some other, thank you. All right, so we've got our selection criteria provided here. It is also in the guidelines, to be clear, but just to kind of give you some overview here, we have the following 4 criteria that we are scoring the applications off of. Starting with strategic alignment, this is just the extent to which the proposed activities align with or support either one or both of the long-term goals of the Pathways program. Going to community served, we want to understand how does your project serve all communities and address systemic inequities within the public realm. Looking at feasibility, we want to understand how feasible is the project proposed itself, considering your resources, relationships, and experience in that work. If it's a joint proposal, we would like to understand how that proposal demonstrates, or how that collaboration, demonstrates a clear and meaningful relationship, that all collaborators listed in the proposal are active contributors to said project. And for the budget, we just need to identify a clear and pressing funding need that supports those activities. And again, those activities need to not otherwise be possible without this funding. For just like with our Treetops program, for those of you that might be familiar, the maximum request amount is 25% of your operating budget. And if you are applying with collaborators, that applies to the cumulative budgets there. All right, moving on to our selection priorities. So we want to emphasize here that these are not selection criteria, which are the ways in which your proposal will be reviewed and scored, but these selection priorities themselves are effectively tiebreakers. So when we get a strong applicant pool, as we tend to do, thanks to you all, we have to understand ways in which we can separate some of these proposals out when we're dealing with a lot of top shelf projects, basically. So just looking at these selection priorities, we want to be transparent in the fact that, we're, as a tiebreaker, looking at whether the project focuses on properties identified as NYC Parks property, which we've linked out to, many of you are familiar with. But I want to be clear that that is not a stipulation of applying. Neither of these priorities are. It is simply a effective tiebreaker in the case of, two extremely close and similar applications, and obviously not enough funding to go around. Our second priority is whether or not the organization is led by individuals who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color. And we have that form clearly written within the application. And I want you all to just understand that that comes back to this priority. So again, folks who might not meet that leadership, that BIPOC leadership component, that does not mean in any way that we do not recognize the value in your work. It does not mean that you are not eligible for the program. It simply means that on our scoring criteria, based on our equitable focus within our grant making practices, that is something that can come into the conversation. And if anybody has any questions on that, please, and just like with all of this, we want to offer as much transparency as possible. So please feel free to shoot your questions our way as well. So we're going to move into the questions component of the day. And thanks to some of your questions submitted in the registration link, we've got some questions to start with. So we figured that we would go ahead and just start with a few questions that were submitted in that registration, and then we'll open up to any questions that have come up throughout this presentation. And then again, it'll be that next step of breakout rooms that you can expect to come next. So I'm going to actually go ahead and kick us off. One of the questions that came up in the registration questions was, is my project eligible? This particular question didn't come with project details to give a specific answer on a project in mind. So my answer to this is simply that, you know, the eligibility quiz that Emily went over that we built into the application serves as an indicator for you. So in that open water platform, depending on how you answer those questions within that eligibility form, which again is the one that Emily was discussing earlier, that will tell you whether or not you are eligible. And yeah, that's basically it. And it's stuff that we've covered here as well as in the guidelines. So we're really hoping that there are no surprises here. We want to not waste anybody's time. But things that come down to your tax status, your experience in the field, and whether or not you have outstanding reports are examples of what would fit under that eligibility criteria. And then just in terms of the rest of these questions, I'm going to go ahead and pass it on to Tim to answer the second question.
So with respect to the second question, I would go first really to the selection criteria that we just saw a couple of slides ago, and as the things that will help that will be used to discern what is a strong application in a highly competitive field. I'll just add a little bit more shade and nuance to that, which is fundamentally the alignment with the goals, which is more resources for the park system, more empowerment for parks partners, and the strengthening and deepening of a coalition of players that will get the civic and public support for those changes, and that the increase in resources and empowerment plays out equitably across the system and really reduces the inequities that exist in the current system because of the lack of funding and empowerment, especially for less resourced neighborhoods and groups. Under the category of feasibility, I want to clarify that it's feasibility with respect to what are the core competencies of your organization and the work that you have done, and how does that align with what you are proposing that you will do? So in that sense, is it feasible that you're able to fulfill the things that you're trying to do in your proposal? Not necessarily the feasibility of the particular ideas or strategies that you're exploring, because as we said before, referencing just again the Cuff report, there may be 20 ideas out there. Some of them may be feasible at this moment in time. Some of them may not be. And that's not a measure of the success. It's really what's the feasibility of your capacity to advance what it is that you want to do in your proposal.
You, Tim. I will take the third question that came in. Heather, if you can go one slide. Thanks. So another pre-submitted question is, can one lead applicant apply for multiple grants with collaborating partners in order to coordinate stewardship and advocacy on a neighborhood level. For the LOI portion, you are welcome to submit more than one application. That might get whittled down before we get to the RFP side of things. But you're welcome to submit more than one. And I'll pass it to Heather, I believe, for the fourth question.
Sorry, didn't realize I was doing the fourth question. What is an example of a project that meets the criteria of the Pathways program? I would say you could develop a project. If you take, again, just referring back to the CUF report as an example, you could look at, and this is probably the least likely one to happen, but take an example of merchandise and bringing money in for the Parks Department for merchandise. You could apply for a grant to hire legal counsel to undertake a review of what would be needed, what kind of contract language would be needed. You could hire a branding consultant to identify a design for merchandise. You know, it's any support that you would need in order to realize a project. The project, as Tim said, may not happen in the end, but you're doing the work to identify the steps that are needed in order to determine the feasibility of the project ultimately. Another example could be if we're looking at keeping a portion of concessions revenue within parks as opposed to having that money go to the general fund. Hire a researcher to identify what other cities have done in this situation and what models could be followed. You could hire legal counsel, again, to identify the kind of legislation that might need to be passed in order to make that change a reality. So it's really any expense that would allow you to determine whether or not your project is feasible and to carry it out. I hope that makes sense.
Great. Thank you, Heather. All right, and I've seen a couple of questions come through the chat. Right now I see two, and one of them has to do with the grant size. Because I covered that under the funding category, I'm unsure if that came up before or after, but that's covered in the funding category as well as in our guidelines. So I don't want to spend too much time on that, but I think it might, just to be clear, it's 50,000 to 150,000. But again, the average grant size last year for a similar program was 51,000, with the max amount being 85,000. And you can't ask for more than 25% of your operating budget. But I also want to make sure to touch on that second question there. Oh, thank you, Angela. I just want to make sure to touch on that second question there as well, which is if you can apply for more than one program, if you're already applying to grassroots. So we don't have a restriction around that from the funding side necessarily, but it is worth acknowledging that these programs focus on two very different things. So with grassroots, you're looking at stewardship and advocacy on a very community-based level within the parks. There are much different budget parameters for that program. This program, the Pathways program, is looking much more at systemic change on a wider scale, which can often require a larger operating budget. So we welcome you to still work through these guidelines and sit in the breakout rooms if that's something of interest to you, particularly with the understanding that we do really encourage folks to work through collaboration on these proposals. So that's that's an outcome that I could see maybe being the most practical, but I also want to be upfront about the fact that these are achieving two very different things. So if you have collaborative partners in mind and you're working in a coalition, you definitely could have some options. So All right, and just taking a look at time, before we move on to next steps in breakout room, I also want to give the opportunity for anybody to just ask a question verbally if you have one. I know folks are on mute, but if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question if they have it, please feel free to do so now. All right. Okay, and I see another question came through the chat as well, asking around multi-borough versus a single borough proposal. So the idea of the program is for it to impact the public realm within New York as a whole on a systemic level. So it would depend on the details of the project in mind for sure, but it's not so much that we're tallying like this person is working in this space, but this person's working in these two spaces. It's more so like, what is the power to achieve those two program priority areas on that systemic level? So, oh, there was somebody,
Yeah,
if somebody,
I mean,
yeah.
I think that this is where it's what aligns with your organization's core strength. Like if there is a borough-based parks coalition that wants to do work that strengthens the power of that constituency, which would be part of a building block of a system-wide change, or building a constituency for a system-wide change. I think in that case, there's a strong case to be made that that entity doesn't need to, it should be aware of how it's coordinating and connecting to other, borough-based coalitions, but it doesn't necessarily have to be doing that work itself. So I think there's a flexibility with respect to that.
Another question that came up in the chat is that we operate on a parks property, but we do not receive parks funding. Are we eligible to apply? Confirmed, you are eligible to apply as long as it's public open land. I do want to specify, as you might have seen in the selection criteria priorities, there is a prioritization that's going towards projects that are operating on parks property. So Martha Snug Harbor definitely qualifies for that as well. And then we have another question that's come in from NYC Wildflower Week. Is there an upper limit for grantee budgets? If my organization, very small, were to partner with a more financially robust parks group, for example, there is not an upper limit on operating budgets for applications to this grant program. I will note there is an upper limit for applications to the treetops and to the grassroots program, but not for the pathways. So we have a final call for any questions before we start working our way towards some breakout rooms. There, can you go to the next slide?
All right, great. So for this next component of the process, we are going to have breakout rooms where we're encouraging you all to be talking amongst yourselves about project ideas, something you're working on, something you want to be working on. And before we go into those breakout rooms, we're gonna take 5 minutes for just a couple of very short questions, and for a bio break, basically. So I know that this is, we're sitting down for a bit, so I want to make sure you all have that opportunity. And once you come back, we will ask you to self-select a breakout room. We are going to have a facilitator in each breakout room, and we're going to take turns sharing the responses to the questions. We're going to share the questions on the next page, and I just want to be clear that it's sort of choose your own journey with the amount of detail you want to provide. There's no wrong answer. This is not intended to put you on the spot. This should just get ideas flowing. We're going to start with each person sharing for really no more than 2 minutes, just based on time restraints. And what their answers to the questions are, and then we'll kind of go from there. And if you choose, like, say you're interested, the breakout rooms are representative of each program area listed in the guidelines. You can choose based on which one you might be applying under. If you're interested in both, or you're not sure which one you're interested in, just choose which one feels like the best fit for you, and know that you can switch if you so choose as well. And then depending on how those go, we'll either come back to this main room at 2:10, or we'll go ahead and continue the conversation in their breakout room for a bit longer and wrap up from there. So we'll go ahead and put the questions up on the next slide. And please, it's 1:47 now. I want to make sure that you all have time to answer these questions and take a bio break if you need. So let's go ahead and meet back here. I think we're going to do 1:53 just to kind of round up. Let's do 1:53. And thank you all. All right. Well, we appreciate your, the ideas that you all have shared in the breakout rooms, and thanks for coming back together here. For next steps, we offer consultations. So as mentioned earlier, if you have ideas that you're trying to iron out and sort of piece together, please do feel free to reach out to NYC Green Fund at cityparksfoundation.org, and you can schedule a consultation. We'd be happy to talk through projects and try to provide more insight into how the program's priorities might align with your work. As Tim emphasized, the nature of this LOI is very much to, put a summation of your work on paper, and not necessarily the full detailed nuts and bolts of the proposal itself, which will help us sort of gain that understanding of alignment early on. If you have any other questions related to the proposal process, proposals, guidelines, review process, any of that, you can also use that same email above, the NYC Green Fund at cityparksfoundation.org. And for those of you who have opted in to sharing your contact information with others on the call today, who have opted in, we will not share your name and email with folks if you selected no to that question when you were registering today. But if you did select yes, and you think that there might be important points of collaboration to be made, we will definitely go ahead and share that out. And we also would like to remind you all that the recording of this webinar is going to be made available on the City Parks Foundation website. So you'll be able to, under that NYC Green Fund page, you see the Grassroots, Treetops, and Pathways program. And within that Pathways program specifically is where you'll find that link. Hopefully you all are familiar with that link. It is linked in the guidelines as well. It is a hub of information, so feel free to check that out. And we have just one final reminder of the LOI deadline here on March 7th. And again, 12 p.m. noon. I know that different grants deadlines might be later in the day. I just want to be really clear. It is 12 p.m. noon. If you have any questions that come up tech related, please feel free to use that same email. Feel free to reach out nice and early, but we really will try to work with you as much as we can on any sort of technological issues leading up to that deadline as well. That's all that I have. I would just really like to thank the funders of the NYC Green Fund, as well as the folks on the call today, Emily Sherrod, Tim Tompkins, and Heather Lubov. It's been really nice to be able to get everybody in one call. And if you all, we just want to make sure that it's an open line of communication. We are available to you all. Thank you so much for joining. And yeah, I don't know if anybody from my team had anything else to add, but that's it for me.
Thank you.